All righty. Welcome everyone to this webinar about data quality, avoiding pitfalls before they are a problem. Before we dive right in to everything, I am just going to go over a few housekeeping items. Since this is a webinar hosted by Avo, and I am Stefania, the CEO and co-founder of Avo. So let's dive in there. Would you mind switching to the next slide, Glenn? I just wanted to make sure we are all here to get the most out of today's session. We want you to share your thoughts because that brings more depth to the session. We want you to ask questions because that brings more value for everyone. If you're thinking it, someone else is probably thinking it too. So post questions in the Q&A. And we'll try to get to them either live or follow-up or Slack, which brings me to the next point. Keep the conversation going with us. Follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Mention us there in juicy discussions or join our Slack community, therighttrack.avo.app. And last but not least, definitely tell us if you're having any audio or video issues, and we will fix those together as soon as possible. So with that, I will hand the emceeing of this webinar over to our very own Glenn.
Cool. Thanks, Stefania. Let's go over introductions. So good morning, good for Vijay at least, good morning, good afternoon, and I guess good evening for me, depending on where you are. So it's 5 p.m. for me, for the records. We've tried to find the slots that works for everybody. For Vijay, it's 8 a.m. and Stefania is somewhere in between. So I guess it would be the same for you guys. My name is Glenn. I'm a co-founder at Human37. And what do we do at Human37? We're a customer data strategy agency. We're based in Brussels, hence the 5 p.m. And we're focused on building customer data infrastructures and making sure that actually your organization is benefiting from that infrastructure and your customers get the best of experiences. That's why you work with Avo, with Mixpanel, and a multitude of other partners. We are Brussels-based, but we actually operate globally, and we're one of the Mixpanel Platinum partners. Handing it back over to Stefania.
Yeah, hello, and thank you. Hello, everyone, again. I'm Stefania. You can call me Steph. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Avo. And you can switch over to the next one, Glenn. We exist to inspire better data cultures so that teams can build better user experiences. What do we do? How do we do that? Avo fixes data quality and product analytics. And in practice, that means that we help teams like Wolt, Fender, Bill.com, Wolt again, apparently according to the slide, IKEA, Boost.com to plan, implement, and observe their analytics so that they don't fly blind and fail to build great user experiences. Our belief specifically in how we do this is that it is important to fix data quality at the source, which means where the data is created by data producers, and that we have to fix it cross-functionally, which means that there's collaboration between data producers and data consumers. And I can't wait to dive deeper into that in this session.
Vijay, your turn.
Cool. Hey, everyone. Good morning for me. Good afternoon for probably most of you. I'm Vijay. I'm the head of product at Mixpanel. I've been at Mixpanel about 7 years, for about 5 years in engineering, and then I moved over to the dark side into product and about 2 years ago. So a bit about Mixpanel. We provide analytics for product marketing and data teams to make better decisions and double down on what's working. We are built on the event-based data model, which we believe is the best data model for self-serve analytics. It's really fast and easy to do advanced behavioral analytics, and you can do so without writing any SQL or any code. Mixpanel can load data from various sources like SDKs, CDPs, data warehouses, and increasingly we're seeing more and more data coming from more and more sources, which makes data governance an increasing challenge for us and a big investment area for us. And we've got over 8,000 paying customers around the world, tracking a lot of events per month. So all sorts of challenges to work on here. But yeah, analytics is only as good as the quality of data. So really excited to talk about that today.
Okay, awesome. Love the quote. Analytics is only as good as the quality of your data. I'm going to put that as a tattoo on my arm. Who's going to laugh? Product data is uniquely complex. It's obviously the reason why we're here. And before we dive into the pitfalls, let's first have a short conversation on why product data is uniquely complex. And I think that Steph has a perfect example.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. I have a tiny nitpick before we continue. I think your mouse is like showing the dock on your computer over the slides. Maybe
so let me reshare. Let me reshare.
Exciting. This is a tiny nitpick. Maybe we will edit this out in the post-production. Maybe it'll just stay in. We'll see.
Should be okay now. Yeah, should be okay.
Thank you. Perfect, Glenn. Thank you. I definitely, so my backstory is that I used to be head of data at a gaming company called QuizUp. I joined there early as the founding analyst, we had just reached 1 million users in our first week then, and I was an early customer of Mixpanel over there. I got the opportunity to build up the data science division and the data culture at QuizUp, and we learned a lot about data quality there, data quality issues, and we ended up building internal tools and processes for solving that problem over there at QuizUp. And it involved cross-functional collaboration, but it also involved rigorous management of schemas. But fast forward a couple of years later, after we had managed to build all of these tools internally, painfully over 3 years or so, then I and a couple of friends from QuizUp, we actually started another company, and it only took us about 3-4 months to hit exactly the same problem again. And I'm going to go through a story that sort of describes the essence of the problem of the quality, like of data quality, how small it can seem, but how big it can get. And sort of with that trigger, when we had that problem again at that company, that sort of triggered us to try to figure out what we could do to solve the problem more extensively. So what we were doing, we were shipping an employee training product to our customers. We're rolling it out to a new customer, and we had noticed in our data that 98% of our users were using email as the sign-up method, and only 2% were using the phone number sign-up method. And we decided here, okay, hey, here's an opportunity to simplify our onboarding journey, simplify the product maintenance and the journey, and sort of make sure everyone converts really straightforward. They don't have to choose. So we moved forward with that. But what happened? Please move to the next slide. Because what we saw is the sign-up conversion, the conversion from someone downloading the app to actually creating an account, plummeted from 81% to 46% after we removed the phone number sign-up method. This was obviously super frustrating. It sort of created a terrible rollout experience for one of our newest customers, in which case their employees for the employee training platform that we had just rolled them onto, only for 46% of the users actually completed creating an account there. So we didn't understand what happened, and we looked at the data again. If you go to the next slide, Glenn, and we learned that it didn't actually look like this that we just saw, but in fact, we had 52% of the data about the sign-up method representing a phone number without the B. And so it wasn't actually 2% of people using the phone number sign-up method. It was, in fact, 53% of people had been using the phone number sign-up method. And so when we threw that out, obviously the onboarding conversion plummeted because just this sort of like, people had a preference for using the phone number sign-up method. But okay, let's take a step back. This is a tiny, tiny typo. It's seemingly so small. But what it cost was us to make a wrong decision about our product based on the data. And what that cost is one of our customers had a terrible rollout experience for when they were adopting our product. It caused us to spend a couple of weeks on an updated onboarding process to remove the phone number as a sign-up method. And then it took us a couple of weeks to discover the conversion drop. And then it took us a couple of more weeks to revert the change that we had made. And so in the lifetime of a small startup, this is, of course, like ages. This is so much time, and it's so much waste, and it's a terrible experience for one of our customers. So it risks our revenue operations. And this is happening all over the world. I'm sure a lot of people right here have had a similar moment to exactly this one. And this is why Avo exists. We ended up realizing that when we talked to hundreds of product managers, data scientists, and developers around the world, 99% of them were miserable about this, and 1% had converted to building something internally like we did at QuizUp. And so we thought it was time to solve that more permanently.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that story. So now the question is, like, what are the common pitfalls that people can walk into or that you should be aware of to prevent them if you're new in product analytics? We've kind of selected 3 for you. Coincidentally, there's 3 people in the panel, so we each have our stories to tell, I guess. First one is about no standards. Second one will be about tracking as an afterthought. And the last one will be trading speed for quality. I'll kick things off with no standards. One of the things that we see is, like, as a customer data strategy agency, we obviously see a lot of analytics implementations at different stages. The easiest part to get somebody on board on analytics is when nothing is there yet, because you still have freedom to set whatever standards you want, right? The tricky thing is when you come in and the implementation has been there for a couple of years, it's been set up by somebody, that person has left, and in the meantime, the organization has scaled, has grown, meaning that different teams have been looking into analytics and different teams have been building different things. Now, the challenge actually starts when you realize that there are no standards. If your product is evolving, there's lack of documentation and lack of standards. People are just building the way that they think they should be building. They bring in past experience, they bring in no experience, they bring in past interpretations or things that they think might be best practice but aren't necessarily, right? And at that point, you get some sort of a Frankenstein analytics implementation that made things very, very hard. We're going to zoom in on 2 particular elements, one being bad taxonomy and the second one being cardinality of events. And we'll go through that in detail with a couple of examples to kind of show you what are these 2 base principles if you're starting with an analytics implementation, or even if you have an ongoing analytics implementation. You can reevaluate these to make sure that we all speak the same language and build analytics based on a couple of shared principles within your organization. Because as it grows, it's going to get decentralized at some point, and it makes sense that everybody understands what are the core concepts and implementation guidelines that your organization is having in order to move forward. So basically, this is how a very simplistic or simplified interpretation of how successful organizations leverage data, right? You collect the data, you get the insights, you activate the data, and activating data can mean a million things. If you're in the marketing space, it could mean I optimize my budget, I built a better landing page, I have a better campaign. If you're in product, it means I have a better understanding of where users get stuck, so I can build a better flow to onboard them. Specific features that might not be clear but are very key to your success as a mobile application, let's imagine that, are not being found easily enough. And based on analytics, you have the insight that power users actually use this a lot, but the discovery is not working well. And data activation in that case means making it more prominent for new users to find that feature to get value from your application and move forward. Why? Because this leads to customer experience, better customer experiences. And our belief is, at least at Human37, is that excellent customer experiences drive growth, right? That's what you're looking for. And growth, to some extent, if you do it well, drives revenue, which means you collect more data, you get more insights, and you get more data activated, build better products, and you get to even better experiences. Now, this is for organizations where things go well. Where it goes wrong for the organizations that are not able to leverage data is, in a lot of cases, the link between data collection and insight. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It's not that they want necessarily collect the bad data. In a lot of cases, it's just that data is not the quality of the data. When I say quality, it could be taxonomy, or it could be that the way the data is structured is not optimal to reach the actual phase of insight. It's not because you're actually collecting all data that your chances of getting insights are 100%. A lot depends on how you're structuring your data and how you're collecting your data for people to make it easy to discover things. And that's what we'll talk about. Now, what causes things to go wrong? Event cardinality. What is event cardinality? Event cardinality is the unique number of events that you have in your implementation. As you know, like Mixpanel, just like a lot of other analytics implementation tools, is event-based, right? An event is an individual action that happens, button selected, and has a number of properties, which could be button color or whatever other things you could think of. Event cardinality or controlling event cardinality is super important if you want to make sure that your analyst doesn't get overwhelmed or if people don't lose their way in the heaps of data that you're collecting. It's important to get error-free analysis as well. Second part is everything that has to do with naming conventions. If I decide to put everything in snake case, but then Vijay wakes up on a Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. and he feels like putting everything in camel case, well, we could be in trouble very quickly because as far as Mixpanel is concerned, these are two individual events, which means that the analysis we might be having or the result of the analysis would be very close to what Steph already mentioned with the phone number and the phone number being written differently. Those would be two different events. And so your insights would be completely biased. Now, what does that look like? Event cardinality or instrumentation in general happens at the start of a project, right? Like me, most people are excited about getting the data in the project and they kind of rush through that phase. Like, let's shoot in a couple of events, not overthink it, but like, let's ship things, let's ship fast and break things, which is usually what happens in the end. It just takes a couple of months before realizing that. And so with event cardinality, the important thing is to think about like, how many unique events do I have? How can I leverage properties in order to reduce the event cardinality? Because if you don't take care of that, this is an actual screenshot that we have for one of our clients, and this was an analysis that they were doing on a daily basis. And the result was that it introduced a bunch of errors. And if you introduce a bunch of errors because you need to make up for your data that is structured very poorly, it also means that you might introduce a lot of errors and as a result get poor insights, biased insights, and actually make wrong decisions. And instead of going to that better experience, you go through the worst experience. And sorry to quote you again, Steph, but it's kind of like the phone number example, right? So how do we prevent like this nightmare analysis within your UI or for your analysts? I'm going to use this example, and I've kind of mocked it up, but it's let's say a 95 or 90% match to what the client was actually dealing with. Our client was a organization that had published a bunch of things, and there were about like 10 types of paywalls, right? Paywalls are basically, if you're not familiar with them, they're kind of pop-ups that protect the content, and you basically need to pay in order to see the content. Think of modern newspapers or any media outlet these days. What they would have is they would have about 20 events. They would have 10 paywall impressions, one for each of the type of paywalls. And they would have 10 clicks, one for every type of paywall that actually got clicked, right? The interesting part is that you get like 20 events. So if you need to figure out like, okay, where is the click-through rate, or on which paywall is the click-through rate the highest, because that's one of the things you want to optimize, you actually need to take into account the full 20 events. The interesting part is you also need to know that there's 20 paywalls, right? If product rolls out a 21st paywall tomorrow, and it's not part of your template or your analysis, everything going forward will be completely biased. If you analyze the data a bit more in depth, what you actually see is that only now, for starters, I have 20 events because our client didn't realize that they were missing one of the prompts. So they actually had a data quality issue, which led to false decisions. But you kind of also can sort this data in two buckets. You can collect or bundle all of the clicks, and you can bundle all of the prompts. And if we now think about event cardinality, we started with 19 or let's say 20, ignore the error that the client made, but we can actually rewrite it entirely to an event cardinality of 2, where the property would be paywall type, and I would be able to see, give me the paywall clicked and break it down by paywall type, or show me the paywall that was shown and break it down by the paywall type. Why is this super important? Imagine I'm the analyst leading the analysis. I have my CEO or my head of product asking, like, show me which paywall is the most important. For starters, I would have made a mistake because I would only have 19 events, assuming that I would have 20. And it would have taken me quite a bit of clicks in order to get there, right? what we're seeing now is that with 2 clicks and 2 breakdowns, we actually get the result. It also means that all of the info is wrapped within the event. I don't need to sum up events, but I can actually break them down, which makes it less error prone and actually makes it more lazy, let's say, for the analysts, which is a good thing because it means that product analytics will be adopted further and insights will be correct. Remember the screenshot I showed in the beginning? So this is the left-hand one that you see on the left-hand side, obviously, with all of the breakdowns and all of the filters. And we've been able to actually transform it in the query you see on the right-hand side. Again, 2 events that are selected instead of like this entire thing, which immediately makes the data and the setup work for us because we've taken time to think through the instrumentation, basically. There's a second part. We've had event cardinality. So reducing event cardinality, very important in order to make sure that the analyst finds their way in the data and errors are being reduced. Second element is naming conventions. One of the things we see is that, and it's not anything against developers, but developers can sometimes be a bit lazy and actually use the event namings that they have internally. They would give it a CSS class or like a function name or something like very non-descriptive, right? It means that for the person analyzing the data or trying to figure out what's going on, it's very hard because they're not familiar with that taxonomy. So what we advise is always to have a clear human readable event and property name. It also means that it could be button selected, it could be prompt viewed, it could be onboarding completed, like very human things to read that leave very little room for interpretation, which also means there's very little room for misunderstanding, which again makes your analysis more correct. It also makes sure that if Vijay gets up on a Tuesday morning at 8, he kind of knows that he needs to keep this in mind and he doesn't need to ship his backend events that have like some weird name in order to get them into Mixpanel. Second element, and this is what we already talked about, is the actual taxonomy, right? In most cases, it doesn't really matter which ones you use. Very specific tools might have very specific do's and don'ts, more don'ts actually, because most tools can handle any casing. It doesn't really matter which one you use, but at least be consistent. If I would send in snake case, if I would send in actually button selected in snake case, and I would send it in kebab case, actually those would be considered 2 events. And my analysis would be more complex because I would again need to add elements or events in order to be able to give a correct interpretation. So what's the solution to avoiding the pitfall of not preparing things properly from the start? First of all, take enough time to go through the event design, or what we call instrumentation. A lot of organizations, a lot of people are super excited, and I get it, to ship the data in. But trust me when I say that after a couple of months or years, you'll regret that, and you'll have to rework a bunch. It doesn't mean that you have to foresee everything or predict everything. That's impossible. Your product will evolve, and you will need to evaluate the way you've been doing things almost on a consistent or constant basis. But having a couple of very simple ground rules like reduce cardinality by grouping events and leveraging property, and focusing on specific naming conventions will get you a very long way and reduce the risk of actually introducing low quality data, which would increase your potential of drawing wrong conclusions and false analysis. And with that, we'll go to tracking as an afterthought, our second pitfall.
Awesome, thanks, Glenn. I'm gonna speak about tracking as an afterthought. This is actually more of a human problem than a technology problem. And I think one of the things that Glenn just mentioned is in terms of enforcing these conventions and making sure you're tracking correctly, there's often this sense that the engineers are lazy and they don't want to track it correctly.
I didn't mean it bad. I didn't mean it bad.
No, it's fine. As a recovering engineer myself, I can agree with aspects of that. But I think a big piece there is just it's more about it's not treated as a priority, right? And it's not something that they're incentivized to do properly and are excited about. And so that's really where data quality kind of becomes an afterthought, and it becomes something that just kind of gets squeezed in at the end. If you can go to the next slide. This is, I think, a classic situation that we've all seen. And this screenshot is literally pulled from Mixpanel's own Slack. And as a product analytics tool ourselves, we still deal with this, where, oftentimes an engineer, really excited, ships a feature, starts rolling it out to 20%. And that's the moment where the PM is like, oh, awesome, that's great. Wait, hold on. Do we have any tracking here? Like, are we even measuring this yet? And it's so common and so easy for this to happen, in part because it's hard to add tracking upfront before you build something, right? Like you have to build it to even add the tracking code. But then once you've built it, there's this eagerness and excitement to get it out the door and ship it. And I think engineers really like to prioritize that because that's what constitutes impact for them. One of the challenges though is kind of pushing back on that, right? Like in this screenshot example, the PM jumped in and pushed back and said, hey, before we roll this out, I know it's super exciting. Let's make sure that we add some tracking so that we can measure these key things. And what was done well here, which I think is really hard to do in the moment, is making it less about here, track these specific events and properties, and telling the engineer, hey, this is what we're trying to measure to define the success of this feature. And I think that is actually a cultural change that needs to happen for data quality to take effect. If you go to the next slide, this is, I think, a root cause of a lot of data quality issues. When the data producers, which are typically the engineers, treat data as an afterthought in their shipping process, the quality of the data suffers. You know, this is kind of like an obvious reality, but it's one that we need to address. So if we go to the next slide, what we found works well is baking your what you want to measure into the start of a project rather than at the end, right? I think we've done this for design really well, right? Where you don't start a project until there's a design prototype in Figma, or we've done this well for like the press release. Like you often want to write the press release first before shipping, right? But I think the missing ingredient to this is tracking and analytics. So the way we've enforced it at Mixpanel, and I think I've seen a lot of successful companies do this, is baking. You usually have some sort of a PRD or product requirements document or something that you're writing upfront when you're planning. Just making sure you add a section in there called measuring success. And this shouldn't just be about what events and properties you need to track. It's really about what metrics you're trying to move, what outcome you're trying to drive with the project. And it's really important to align with both product and engineering leadership about this and about this template, because that's something that, while they may not think about prioritizing tracking, they'll always think about making sure their whole team is defining success up front. And so if you have this as part of the product requirements document, you can bring in an analyst to review it. You can make sure your engineers understand this is the thing we're trying to move up front, so that the project isn't considered a success until tracking is added. The other complementary piece to this is having a review process, right? I think many product teams have something like this. We have a Slack channel called product reviews, where the designer and the PM share the design of the feature they're building and the PRD and what the press release is going to look like up front. And as product leaders and engineering leaders, making sure part of what you're reviewing there is the tracking plan. And how are we going to know this thing is successful, right? And actually pushing on that feedback in that process, ahead of time. Again, what this ensures is that once you have a clear sense of what you're trying to move, I think the engineers building the feature will naturally get a sense of, okay, my success for this project is not shipping this thing, it's moving these metrics. To know whether I move them, I have to measure them. So I think while this isn't quite a technology problem, it's a really important human problem that as product leaders and as data leaders, we need to address. So the high level recommendation here is baking tracking plans and success measurement into the processes you already have, like PRDs and product reviews, to make sure that they actually get prioritized and get done. Cool. With that, I will pass it over to Steph to talk about trading speed.
Thank you. And I think, so to open that section, trading speed for quality, this is something that I have just seen tons of companies have troubles with. They're choosing between the speed of shipping or data quality for measuring the success of the release that they're shipping. And what we've talked about so far today, the lack of standards and tracking as an afterthought, it all ties directly into exactly what we're about to talk about. So if you can go to the next slide, Glenn, here. So what, this is sort of a quadrant sort of map that we like to show the people that we help with data quality, so that they can sort of understand where they are in this, where do they position themselves. And I think that most companies go through the journey of starting in the bottom left, the bad quality, it's shipped slowly, and then they go typically before everything else, before they realize that data quality is important or how to think about it, they go into bad quality shipped fast. And what that looks like, the symptoms of that is exactly what Vijay just went through. That's the symptoms you might see on Slack, where someone is like, hey, actually, do we have any tracking for that? Or another version of it is a little bit later, which is, maybe the CEO is asking, how did this release go? And you're like, what release? What are you talking about? As a data person, you maybe don't even know that there was a release that went out. And so nobody really got the sort of memo to think about tracking. So the scale of this is that you either do this super quickly as the last thing that you do before shipping. And so you sort of don't take the time to think about the event cardinality or the naming conventions or anything like that. You don't take the time to think through what are you going to use your data for. And so if you don't take the time to do that, then you will not design good data. You'll just design like a few events that describe maybe the product feature that you're releasing, but it doesn't tell a whole story in context with your entire product. And so that's the scale. You either release really bad data or you release no data at all. But at least you shipped fast, And so that's sort of a difficult position. And I think like this is a position that I've personally been in. And the CEO said to me, Steph, you're responsible for retention. And I'm like, all righty. But as a data person, you're not really, you don't really have the authority to manage anything like that. And so the tool that we decided to use to try to influence that was to try to sort of create ownership of data and enthusiasm for data among the product teams. So that was sort of the strategy that we took. And so then we moved on to the next quadrant. We sort of like managed to get people to care that we don't want to ship our products before we know that there's quality data behind it. And so then we go into good quality, but before we have tools and processes to make sure that we have good quality, then it just takes a long time. There's just a lot of manual things around that. And that sort of brings me to the next slide a little bit. This is sort of what the typical analytics workflow looks like when you are when you're in that quadrant of wanting quality data, but you don't really have good tools to do that. So it starts over there at 0 in the upper right, left corner. A product manager decides on product changes. Okay, they do that in a Figma, they do that in a Google Doc maybe, or something like that. And then they maybe pull in an analyst at some point because you have decided as a company that you care about data. So you are going to involve an analyst somewhere. And so that analyst typically maybe writes up the product metrics in a spreadsheet. Potentially your company has developed some sort of a JSON schema management for events or an Airtable, but also maybe just a Slack message. That's also very common. And so someone designs, how are you going to measure the success? Like, we're going to move the needle for day one retention. Okay, what events do we need for that? Well, we need to add this property to our sign up event, and then we need to add the event for chat message sent at the end of the game screen or something like that. So that's the definition of the metrics and the events. And then from there, you go to implementation of the analytics events. And so you basically hand this information over to a developer to get feedback. Can we actually track it this way? Can we implement these events? Does that make sense? Do we have access to this metadata at this point in time in the product? Sort of at that point, you may get some feedback from the developer. That happens in maybe Asana, maybe Slack. So typically, when you go into step 2 there, getting feedback, you already make data design changes, but it isn't represented in your original tracking specs, which you created in step number 1. And so there's already a lot of back and forth and lossy information here. And then you go into step number 3, which is implementing the analytics events into code. And you end up with all of these different analytics event versions because so many different teams manage sort of different touch points to different user actions, and you have multiple platforms, and just no way of really standardizing what the event should be called, and making sure it's actually typed in correctly and things like that into code. So after that, you move into step number 4. You verify that the implementation is according to the spec. But typically in that process, you catch something, but you don't catch all of it. And so at this point, you typically have to throw this back to the developer and be like, I'm so sorry, but I found a bug. I have to ask you to task switch and go back to fixing the analytics for this thing that I know that you stopped working on and stopped thinking about, but we have to do it before we ship. And that's how you're slowing down the product release, because you sort of want quality data. And you know, we've added a bunch of arrows into this chart because, you know, all of this is a lot of back and forth across so many different tools and conversations. And there's sort of, it's all very disjointed. And then eventually you ship this and you go and try to figure out how it went, and you use a tool like Mixpanel. Unfortunately, there is not, you don't get the insights that you need because you managed to ship a data bug even though you tried your best not to. So it's like a terrible, terrible, terrible experience, and everyone hates it. And I think so if you, yeah, so the core there is like, what can we do to make this process simpler? And I think it's twofold. Number one is what Vijay just covered. Oh, balloons, that's nice. Vijay just covered the human part a little bit, or sort of like, how can we think about this as a process? And the other thing is tooling, and how can we sort of optimize this process from a tooling perspective, so making sure the information is connected at the right places. And so I just want to echo really heavily what Vijay just shared about, like, it's so valuable if when you start pulling the developers as stakeholders into the planning process for analytics, and pulling analytics directly into the planning process for product. The reason is that when developers are a part of the conversation about what to measure, then they typically will care a lot about it, because developers are typically very smart people, and we very much underestimate them. I think this is a trap that a lot of people fall into, like assuming they won't care about analytics at all, and assuming that they will just think about this as a chore that they have to do for the analyst. But it's really valuable if you're able to convert your organization so that developers actually see analytics as one of the fundamental tools to measure the success of your product. So that's sort of a really, really important piece of it. And then let's look a little bit at the tooling. So if you go to the next slide, Glenn. This is part of the solution that we originally built at QuizUp internally, and I've talked to tons of people that sort of have wanted to build something in this direction, maybe converted to doing it. And this is also something that we offer today at Avo, which is you are able to define your schema at one place, which is in Avo, in the Avo tracking plan. And then from there, it automatically connects into your code base for the developer. So the developer has the context of the analytics event directly in the context of their editor, their IDE. When they're writing the code for the feature, then they also have access to which events should be tracked and the structure of those events. So that's really valuable. And then we have sort of tools for debugging, whether that's accurately implemented and all those things. So connecting the schema directly to the developer experience is the first touch point that we're sort of trying to minimize the friction points. And then if you go to the next slide, Glenn, the other really valuable reduced friction point is that Avo is able to publish your schemas, the ones that you create in like step 1 when you're creating your specs, the analytics events. We are able to publish those directly into the context of when the product manager or the analyst is actually working with the analytics events within Mixpanel, or wherever else you'll be working with your analytics events. You can also include the schemas in your databases, for example. And so this really reduces the amount of times you as a data team have to answer the question, what is the event for X again? It sort of like really helps people use the right events at the right place. So if we summarize a little bit, if you go to the next slide, Glenn. So this is that same map of the typical analytics release workflow. And I know this map may look equally complex, but we have streamlined every single part of this process so that each step has been simplified and connected to each other in a way more streamlined and automatic way. So if you're getting started in the first place, you can import your tracking plan directly from Mixpanel or somewhere else. And then you go into the same planning process as the other, the ones that I just described in a horrible way, but instead of it taking multiple days, it'll take you minutes to go from planning an analytics update to reviewing and approving, to implementing the analytics events, to validating it, and to merging and publishing your schemas so that they're available directly in Mixpanel. And the beautiful thing, one of my favorite things about the publishing part, like publishing your schemas directly into Mixpanel, is that you can start building your dashboards in Mixpanel before they have been populated with data. So this is a favorite thing that we do at Avo when we have designed our analytics releases and we're about to start working on the feature. We go through the process of planning the release, and we go through what we call purpose meeting, which I posted in the chat earlier, a link to the purpose meeting where we sort of plan our metrics. We go through that process and we design the analytics events, and then we publish the analytics events into Mixpanel. Then we build our dashboards, and then later when we finish working on the feature and we've released it, our dashboards are actually, they're just ready for us to look at them when the data has started populating into them. So that's sort of one of my other favorites about sort of this, because then you don't have to restart your process of thinking, how did we decide to measure this again? You just have your dashboard ready, basically. Yeah, and so if you go to the next slide, a quick summary of this, basically build towards self-serve analytics governance, but do it with standards and conventions. And so I think from my perspective, the utopia is that every team can manage their own analytics. The data is of high quality and we ship fast, but to get there, you might have to go through a few steps. So you go from the wild west of every team is sort of doing this on their own, and then you go away from that, you sort of require some sort of a centralized governance. And from there, you start building standards and processes and tools that minimize the overhead. And on that note, with the examples that Glenn shared in the beginning, that probably triggered the majority of us that are here. If you're using a good sort of tracking plan management solution, for example, Avo, then Avo will help you make sure you are not creating a duplicate version of an event that already exists. So for example, if you try to create start game when you already have a game started, then Avo will warn you and say, this is very similar. Are you sure you want to create another version of this event? And that will help you go from a centralized governance step into like a decentralized where every team can manage their own data, but it's still of high quality. And then you enter the magic state where the data team can actually start working on the things that they were hired and what the things that they wanted to do instead of just governing data the whole time.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks for sharing stuff. We talked about the common pitfalls. So as a recap, no standards, part I took care of, tracking as an afterthought, part that Vijay took care of, and trading speed for quantity. And how do we solve these pitfalls in like one beautiful sentence? Adopt clear standards to start with, consider tracking upfront, and minimize handoffs. We still have some time for a Q&A. Gonna see if there are a bunch of questions coming in. I haven't been able to read through everything.
Great questions here.
Yeah, there's a bunch that are really, really good questions that I think we should try to get through all of them. Okay, so I can maybe read out the questions and then we can all give our answers.
Yeah.
So Elmira asks, how do you make sure that standards are in use given the speed of new developments? How do you grow this culture inside the company? I think that's related to another question that Tom asks towards the bottom around like What if you find yourself in a situation where engineers are uninterested in setting up events? So yeah, I can maybe take the first stab at this one because I think it's a bit related to that second pitfall in that section. So I think one challenge that I found is it's really hard to influence outward in an organization and get every IC engineer to care about it. And it's often a lot easier to just get, your director of engineering or VP of engineering, VP of product to care. And that's the way it kind of gets enforced throughout the company. And the thing that I found works well is like there's a push and pull there. So the push is that they often want to set standards for how product development is done throughout the company, right? Like they probably have some template where that's like a PRD, like what I showed, which says like, okay, these are the things I expect before we begin any new product investment. I think it's just like the most important thing is making the case to them that how will we measure success of this thing is part of that PRD. Once you do that, they'll start asking for it in every one of their one-on-ones. They'll start asking their managers about it. They'll start making sure that's a thing and it's part of performance reviews and all that stuff. And once something is part of performance reviews, everyone starts giving a shit about it, right? And I think that's a really important vector that I think is underutilized in terms of enforcing data culture. And then the question is, how do you influence a director of product or VP product or VP engineering? I think the big thing is, the main thing that they're scared about is they're allocating a lot of the company's money to make investments. And the thing they have to be accountable to their CEO or the board about is, did these investments actually pay off? And should we be doubling down or pivoting? And the thing that they're constantly lacking is visibility into what's working or not. So step one is like, hey, how would you like visibility into all of your product features and releases is the question to ask them. They'll all say 100% yes, I want that. And the second thing is, how would you like to make sure that when you present a number to the CEO or the board, you're sure it's accurate and you're not going to present something and then have to backtrack a week later and say, oh, actually that was missing, this piece of data, or that was a typo, so that didn't work. And they'll say, oh my God, that's my worst nightmare. I never want to do that. And that's where you're like, great, do I have the solution for you? You need to bake in tracking into all of the project planning and templates and make sure all the engineers give a shit about tracking and data quality. And they'll be like, oh, that's all I need to do. Okay, fine. That's easy for me to do. I can just enforce that in my one-on-ones. So I'd say that's the number one way to get this culture enforced. Like, don't try to be a hero and go outward and try to do it at the bottom. Escalate and do it at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, let them figure out the processes and systems for that. Sorry, Steph, go ahead.
No, just thank you so much for sharing this, Vijay. I couldn't agree more with exactly what you described. And maybe just adding one little thing to it that I always recommend is start by trying to create a case study. So I think or an internal case study. So start something small. Start with like a simple feature. Don't start with your company-wide North Star metric, for example, because that'll require alignment of everyone. Just start with like a simple next feature release. This came from you, Glenn, right? Don't start with your North Star metric in the beginning. Yeah. And start with something small and sort of highlight and sort of show how beautiful the process can be and how rewarding it can be if you're a part of it from the beginning. And I can share that, like, if you do this and involve developers in the process of actually thinking about how you want to measure it and what impact you're trying to have, we literally at QuizUp went from like one developer occasionally asking about Mixpanel charts to like 70% of them proactively coming to us and be like, hey, I'm about to work on this feature. I'm thinking about measuring it this way. What do you think? Okay, cool. And these are the data designs that I think that we're going to propose for it. Does that work? Will that work in the Mixpanel retention chart? Will that work in the, and so it's sort of like it's a flywheel that you're building. Think about it that way. So this was on.
Sorry,
go ahead.
This was on sort of like a mix of the question from Tom and also the top question from Elmira.
Yeah.
I just want to also say about how do you make sure that standards are in use given the speed of developments? I would say there are two things there that in addition to the processes, it is good to have tools for this. So you want to have some sort of data quality, like data observability tool that is monitoring the data that you released, and specifically while you're migrating away from everyone going through processes to migrating away from the Wild West to processes, then you still want to have insight into what data is being released without me knowing it. Avo Inspector is a great way to observe that. I know you can also get those events directly into Mixpanel lexicon, like unplanned events. And then when you start adapting tools for defining your standards, then you just want to document your standards. And like I shared earlier, Avo will help you specifically hold your team automatically up to standards. And you can sort of control what naming conventions you want your team to follow directly in the Avo UI, for example. But if you're using a spreadsheet or a JSON schema, then you just want to document it really clearly. That's my recommendation. Any additions to that, Vijay or Glenn?
No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, yeah, in general, like you want your tooling to help you fall into the pit of success rather than fall into the pit of mistakes and failure. So like tools like Avo are great that way because it's hard to make a mistake. By default, you're doing the right thing. So that's a great way to think about it. Cool. I just want to make sure we're getting to the other ones. How do folks, so Oscar asks, how do folks approach synthetic data? This is something that is important in the analytics workflow. Depending on what metrics we're looking into, sometimes a funnel report is needed to answer questions. So producing different data points is needed in order to validate the implementation for pushing to production. I guess this sounds to me like generating mock data of what the data should look like. Yeah, the way I think about this is we generally don't. Like we try to dog food the features that we build, like we use it internally. And typically we have like, what are the key user flows, right? Like usually that's sitting in Figma or something like that. Like what flows and paths do we want the user to take? And what would we like to know at each of those points? And you kind of build up your tracking plan kind of visually from that. And then track that for your own internal usage. And when you put the feature out into beta to start getting a sense of what that looks like, because you know nothing beats production, I guess. Is what I'd say. And I'd say the other thing is on that, you should start tracking live, but have a development and production environment tracking standpoint. So it's not like you're generating synthetic data. It's just that some data goes to a dev project, maybe like your own internal usage of your product, and then some goes to production.
Yeah, I think this like question is like maybe it's I think there's a chance to interpret it in two ways. But I think your interpretation is like exactly what I would do the first one. It's basically like confirm that you have the right data that you need to answer your questions, right? That's what we're trying to confirm. The other way is what we were talking about yesterday, Vijay, which is like design your data top down, visualize your charts before you design your data to understand like what exactly will help me make a decision. And I think that's also something that like I will sometimes do that when I'm running a purpose meeting. I would like draw up a chart. Like if we draw this chart like this and it looks like that, will we know that the feature was a success? Because it just helps people think through like what are the data points that we need. So I think like I encourage you to do that and think that way. And I'll share that like the original prototype for Avo was exactly this, like helping people design better data. But the other way around is like +1 on what Vijay said, have a development project, like always have a development project and a production project. And when you are testing your data before you release it, before you release the app into the App Store, make sure you're sending the test data into the development project or a staging project. Like do not contaminate your production Mixpanel instance with like the development data. And I recommend just always making sure that happens.
There's one thing I want to add on synthetic data, because for some reason it's my new favorite topic. We use it not in the context of testing. A lot depends on which clients, for instance, but we use it a lot in order to show proof of value, especially if you have multiple systems connected. It's one of the use cases, and I can share the video afterwards to Oscar if you reach out. There's a bunch of tests, for instance, that you could run if you have data ingested by segment and then shipping it to Mixpanel, for instance, just making sure that your entire flow works, especially as well if you're ingesting sensitive data around PII, or you want to do some tests without actually ingesting your PII. I recommend frameworks like faker.js in order to generate bunches of fake or synthetic data without compromising your actual user base and using them for things that might potentially go wrong, because that's what you want to avoid, right? That's it.
Cool.
Nice.
So Sundar asks, is there a recommended way to enforce adoption of conventions, example, naming conventions for event names at a code level, so that when an engineer in the team adds Mixpanel tracking code that violates these conventions, it's blocked at the pull request stage? I feel like this is the perfect question for you, Steph.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I would say there are two steps where you want to be monitoring it. It is in the data design step. Are people designing, I love these Zoom features where I'm doing.
I don't know what's going on because you had balloons all the time. I don't know what you did for that.
Yeah, I don't know. It came with a new Sonoma operating system. I'll do one instead of thumb up. So the first step where you have to monitor this is then the data design step, because there are people designing event schemas, and you want to make sure that the event schema design gets reviewed by someone who knows what they're talking about. You can use a tool like Avo, which is fantastic and which is why we built it. But if you're doing a spreadsheet, then you just want to have a human that reviews your designs and make sure they fit the spec. Or fit the naming convention. The second, of course, is to confirm that the implementation matches the specification. And sort of to echo what Vijay was highlighting earlier here today, which is like engineers get blamed for the implementation of the data, but very often the mistake happens at the data design level. Like you have someone that doesn't have the holistic picture of what data exists in the company, and so they design analytics events that don't fit that standard. So it's at those two steps. And if you don't have Avo, then you want to processify this. You want to make sure that people don't ship data. I don't know what's happening with the balloons, but I love it. You want to make sure people don't ship data that hasn't been reviewed, or like to start implementing data that hasn't been reviewed from a design standpoint. But like Vijay is highlighting, Avo as a solution is specifically built to help anyone design quality data, independent of how much data design experience they have. I love one framing that a customer of Avo once said, Avo is the well actually person that you don't want to be. Well, actually, you should actually name this event this way. And so instead of you have to be that annoying person, you can get that automatically.
Yeah, and then one thing I'll add here, it's on a related note, is one of the features Mixpanel shipped somewhat recently is called event approval, which is a setting you can set in your project, where basically if an event is unexpected, it's hidden by default in the project until an admin goes and validates and approves it, and a notification goes out to a Slack channel to say, look at it. So it's sort of like a push and pull. Like you want to push the conventions into the code, which is what Avo does. So a developer gets like code time feedback. And then there's sort of this other end where if something somehow makes it through, you want to have it by default hidden rather than by default visible, which is a good way to double check.
And maybe like to follow up with that, like the publishing feature that I was talking about with Avo will automatically approve these events within Mixpanel. So they will be approved if they've been designed and pushed. We have to follow up with some of these other questions, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do that over email, but I really also encourage you to join us in a continued conversation on the righttrack.avo.app, where we can have a follow-up conversation about these subjects. Any other thoughts, Vijay and Glenn, on this? Like a final question or something that we want to address before we leave?
Yeah, let's maybe we can just do one more and then call it, because there's some great questions here. In particular, this one from Kareem. Tools like Mixpanel Amplitude, we need to identify the elements we want to track and then request devs to implement code for tracking, whereas tools like Heap and Pendo auto capture everything. How does Avo approach working with these two cohorts of tools differently? I can maybe give a quick answer here, and then I'd love Steph and Glenn to so this is, I think, a big one. Like for those that aren't aware, there's this difference between precision tracking, which is where you explicitly say you want to track these specific events with specific properties, and then automatic tracking, where you just turn it on typically on a web page, and it auto tracks every HTML element and your whole web page. I'd say if you care about data quality, precision tracking is the main way to go, primarily because it doesn't run the risk of automatically breaking when you change your website, right? Like, so for example, if you're tracking every HTML element and then suddenly you change something about your website or design, all your tracking inadvertently breaks, and it's really, really hard to detect that. So when precision tracking, I think the other aspect of it is being intentional, like of what, it's not about tracking every element on the page. It's like what Steph was saying, working backward from what is the metric you're trying to move to what specific things you want to track. Because there's no point in tracking something if it's not going to be used. So in general, I'd say defining what you want to measure and then sort of trusting developers to track in the best way to measure that thing is the highest odds of success, highest likelihood of quality, highest likelihood of value. Of course, if you have absolutely no developers and it's a static website, then yeah, I think the auto track approach is fine for that, but it doesn't quite make sense for apps.
Yeah,
there's one thing I want to add to that, Vijay, is like the whole concept of data minimization and PII data that gets ingested, which with precision tracking, you have a huge amount of control about what you do and what you don't. With auto tracking, there's always kind of the chance that you start ingesting stuff that you should not, and that shouldn't even hit your systems, right? It's one of these concepts that we're focusing on a lot on our end, obviously because we live in Europe and we're born and raised under GDPR in the last couple of years. So we really need to be careful about what we do, why we ingest it, if we should ingest it, and how we minimize the data around it. And the fact that we have flexible structures with manual tracking or precision tracking actually helps a lot there.
Yeah, plus one. And I think like another angle that I like to add to this is like, or there are two main reasons from my perspective why precision tracking or custom event or explicit tracking, whatever we want to call it, is valuable. Is number one, you can't guarantee in auto tracking that you will have the data that you need. You can hope, but you can't guarantee it. So you might need some metadata attached to your events that you don't have if you just rely on like automatic object parsing from the DOM and like technology like that. And then the second one is just like volume and noise, which I think is eventually why even when you're using Pendo and Heap, you convert to not only having auto tracking, you convert to having precision tracking or custom tracking, even when you're using these tools, because you want to have explicit things just reliably there and know exactly what you're doing without having to rely on the volume of like and the noise of everything else. So exciting though. There are so many great questions here. Do we want to go for one more or end this right now, Vijay? Glenn?
Sure, why not?
I have time for one more, so let's go.
I also have an open poll here, whether you would like to learn more about Avo, Mixpanel, or Human37, and whether you would like us to get in touch. And so feel free to throw your answers in there.
Well, I guess it's let's do Ali's and we'll call it the last one, and we can feel free to email us or post on the YouTube if you have other questions. But in your experience, how easy is it for the engineering team to adopt this new tool and process? Yeah, I guess I can quickly give mine. I think there's a push and pull here. The push is it's like getting the engineers excited about this, and I think again the biggest thing is getting them to think in terms of outcomes instead of outputs. It's not like I shipped these 5 features this half, but it's I drove activation rate. A really good example is on our growth engineering team. The engineers themselves make the dashboards, like without the PM almost, just like they make the first cut of the dashboard and they're like, we're trying to move this metric up. I'm going to start shipping and then see if it starts moving things. Then they will adopt all the best tools for the job and get stuff done. The second way is to make that way the easy way, which is I think what tools like Avo enable by baking data quality and governance into the engineer's workflow. So they're not bouncing between, Git and a spreadsheet and a Jira ticket. They're just living in their workflow. So if you get the engineering team excited and adopt a tool that is baked into their workflows, it's very easy. Like in over the course of a few days, they can get started. Yeah,
and maybe to sort of like call one thing out, an important note about Avo. We have single player mode for data professions. You can start using Avo today to audit your current analytics and sort of get a report in your face. And you can import your tracking plan directly and start managing your release from there before anyone else in your company starts adopting that process, because we integrate directly, for example, with your Jira or whatever else you want to manage it. And we have data quality tools that help you manage the quality of your data at the source without the codegen, without requiring developers to change their behavior. You don't need to go full blown like, hey, okay, are we going to adopt Avo and ask every single developer to do something differently from here on out? It doesn't work like that. You can start using Avo for your tracking plan management, and then sort of gradually offer the developers to ease their workflow as well by starting to use the Avo codegen as well. So that's, I think, is really important. Don't have that be the blocker for you getting a better experience in your tracking plan management and more insights into your data quality.
Cool.
Right. Should we then, I think we have just a thank you slide with information on how to get in touch. Makes sense to throw that out there. Definitely was wonderful to be here with you today. And thank you everyone for such great, fantastic questions. And thank you, Vijay and Glenn, for a great session.
Thank you for having us.
It's always wonderful to be filled in a room filled with such smart people. So is that if anyone wants to join our community, it's therighttrack.avo.app. And please, if you learned something fantastic today, definitely go ahead and share that with us. Mention us on LinkedIn or Twitter, or DM us there. We're always excited to hear what you thought. And if you completely disagree with something that you heard here today, we also are very excited to hear that and participate in that conversation. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Vijay and Glenn.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks everyone.
Have a great night, in my case.
Exactly. Have a great rest of your day, Vijay, and everyone on Pacific.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Bye.